There's an acronym that we all live with today in the business world, ESG, environmental, social and governance. It's driving so much business thinking, so much attention. But where does that acronym come from?
I think it probably owes its lineage back to 2004, and Kofi Annan, who very much had this as a passion project, brought together the terms environmental, social, governance into one collective space. So we had, what can analysts do to rate ESG? How can advisors like Capco, how can they talk to ESG and think of it within a consulting space? It talked to banks, it talked to insurers. So it really was the first time which you saw that whole ecosystem come together in one place.
How might we see ESG factors being taken into account more in strategic and tactical asset allocation, portfolio construction and investment strategies?
I think historically we've seen a lot of portfolios constructed around risk and reward. The risk is to the return and to the company overall. But when you think about ESG as an overall topic, it really does sit within the whole value chain of risk. It's environmental risk, it's social risk, which can be PR related, it could be employee actions. And then from governance, we saw such things as Enron when there was poor governance, poor accounting, poor behaviours from the very, very top down. So really ESG, from my perspective, doesn't really sit as a separate thing. It's something that's always been there. It's just been now brought together in one place.
I think this is a big shift, actually, moving away from so-called greenwashing, ESG featuring mainly as a marketing trend, actually to being core part of risk management. The risk of catastrophic loss of shareholder value from a management team making a misstep in ESG in some way, or indeed over time getting it wrong to the extent that value is destroyed. Investment teams are more and more bringing ESG factors formally into their investment framework, and it will no doubt drive investment decision making much more as teams become more sophisticated at analysing and incorporating these types of risks in strategies.
And you can see that to some extent from the size of the teams. To your point on greenwashing, it was a nice thing to have from a marketing perspective. It was something on the periphery that made people feel good about buying something for their portfolio, be it a manager or somebody who's looking to select a pension for themselves. But you're right, it is becoming quite fundamental now to the overall risk framework, and you can see that across the board in many different asset owners, looking just at the scale of the teams. I read a report recently that suggested, whereas before there'd been 2 or 3 people in some of the major pension funds and asset owners, not more than 5 years ago, now they've all ramped up to teams of between 20 and 40 people as a core fundamental for the selection process.
So we can agree that ESG is going to be a fundamental part of how investment decisions are made. For me, it raises an important question. Who sets the criteria? Who defines what is good? Who defines what matters? Governments and regulators are starting to get involved, but not to the point that they can help firms determine precisely what decisions to take. Often it's left to small groups of people, managing boards, investment committees, individual fund managers. What are your perspectives on this, Charles?
I think we've reached an inflection point, actually, Richard, around ESG and who's in charge of it, who's the arbiter of it. You can see that in the past it was governments, councils, local authorities, to some extent external influencers, the fourth sector, NGOs, suggesting what good looked like. Coming forward, we're actually getting a lot more almost supply side pressure now from people. So it's the customers, whether they're buying a pension fund, a financial product, a credit card, they want to know the green credentials there. So the governments will always be fundamental, and we can see that again looking back at Kofi Annan and how he put this together to try and push this initially. You're seeing taxonomy laws coming down through Europe and various other regulations across the world. But I think we're probably going to see more and more pressure coming via the actual consumer base, and they're looking to ESG accreditation, to various different standards that are being set by various different bodies. I think the interesting point, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this, is around standardization and who gets to be the global judge of these things, because there's huge differences. You only have to look at the indexes and how they judge the same company One can say it's top-notch, it's ESG compliant, and another very credible indices judge can say something totally different.
I agree. Our research paper indicated exactly that point. For me, it's about standardization and probably transparency. If asset owners, asset allocators, retail investors can understand the criteria that are being used and how those criteria are being applied, they can make their decisions on where they put their money, and ultimately it will be investor demand that determines which approach is the approach that wins out. So I think it's incumbent on the industry to find ways of providing the right kind of helpful transparency that allow people to make informed decisions about where their assets are allocated to.